Let me just make sure the video cues. You wake up. The room is spinning very gently around your head, or at least it would be if you could see, which you can't. Does anyone know where this sentence comes from? Anyone? How's this for a hint? The year is 1984, and you're sitting in front of the blue screen of an IBM personal computer with no disk drives and 16K RAM, playing a game on DOS prompt. Anyone know? So the sentence comes from an interactive computer game called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and the girl playing it was me, age 10. To give you an idea of how rare this was in 1984, only 8 houses out of 100 had a personal computer. I was lucky. My father was a computer scientist, and for me, this was dad time, exploring this new frontier of the computer and fictionalized worlds that, for an imaginative mind, felt like the opening of a door onto a different reality. In another part of the house, my mother was also opening the doors on a different part of reality. She was a clinically trained psychotherapist in private practice. People shared their dreams and stories with her and helped them use these experiences to unlock memories and reshape patterns of behavior. I found both worlds fascinating. But not until 20 years later would I realize how these two worlds would collide. You see, 20 years later, I also found myself in a spinning room, surrounded by darkness, with no idea how I had gotten there. The year was 2010. I had been the victim of a violent, targeted robbery. And as in the case of many victims of trauma, to this day, I still remember very little of the event. But what is known is the fact that the event left me so damaged I could barely function. And that was when the worlds truly collided. Neither technology, nor psychology, nor psychopharmacology were any help to me at all. I had to find a new path, a hybrid path, which is, after all, what medtech is. So, how many of you have ever taken drugs? I would like to see a show of hands. And by drugs, I mean anything, like, antibiotics, aspirin, cough syrup. Come on, guys, I know you've all taken this. All right. So how about another show of hands? How many of you have taken psychedelics? Magic mushrooms, LSD, MDMA. Don't worry, folks, it's not criminalized in Portugal, so you can raise your hand. Most likely, many of you are not raising your hand because of stigma, because of the fear of being judged. But what if you were using psychedelics to treat a mental health issue? Would you still feel stigma then? The sad answer is probably yes. Because mental health issues are often thought of as bad or shameful, even though so many of us, indeed most of us, will experience a mental health issue at some point in our lives. No one here would be embarrassed to admit they had broken a bone. Am I correct? But yet, it seems that even now, in 2017, most people are embarrassed to say that they have grappled with issues such as depression or anxiety, despite how common they really are. The statistics speak for themselves. Imagine this. 1 out of every 10 people in this room is on some sort of antidepressant. And 1 out of every 4 of you will suffer from a mental illness at some point in your lives. As the writer Rita Mae Brown once said, take a look at your 3 best friends. If they're okay, then it's you. Let's get some water. The fact is that mental issues will touch most of your lives at some point in some form, and yet we still treat it as a rare and terrible curse. The idea is embedded in the very language we use to speak about the issue: mental illness. You often hear that somebody became mentally ill all the time. But how often do you hear about somebody who was mentally ill, but no longer is? Not very often. And that's part of the stigma, and that's part of the problem. But people do get better. And I'm here today to advocate for a new way of looking at this. Sorry. So to help with that, I came up with a phrase that I suggest we start using instead: mental injury. Because the word injury suggests a fundamental similarity between, say, depression and a broken bone. Because the fact is that both things can actually be healed. And I myself am living proof of that. When, in 2010, I woke up with my head throbbing, with no idea what had happened to me or how I had gotten to that place, I discovered that I had been drugged and robbed. Devastated, I told almost no one of what had happened to me. But still, I couldn't shake it. It had changed me. I started getting panic attacks, night sweats, an uncontrollable temper, and a deeply gutting sense of sadness that quite literally brought me to my knees. And I thought, this, as all things, shall pass. Just hold on. And I held on. For years. Eventually, I was diagnosed with clinical post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. I tried all the conventional routes for coping with PTSD: therapy, exercise, meditation, psychiatric drugs, you name it. But nothing really worked. And yet here I am. Today, on a stage, in front of hundreds, if not thousands, of people, to understand just how momentous a change this is for me, you have to understand that this accident turned me from a vivacious, outgoing young woman into something of a broken hermit who lived in fear. Fear of contact with other people, fear of something happening again. But now, miraculously, here I am, standing in Lisbon, talking to you about precisely the thing that for me was unspeakable for years. So I bet you're asking yourselves the obvious question. So what happened? How did I turn things around? And the answer is that I discovered for myself one of the most promising tools of medtech, something that I believe is poised to revolutionize mental health care and the way that we deal with mental health issues. So what happened? Psychedelics happened. According to the dictionary, a psychedelic drug is a substance whose primary action is to alter cognition and perception, typically by way of hallucinations. Psychedelics have been used for thousands of years to cope with mental injuries elsewhere in the world. But in the West, somehow, in our zeal to crack down on all illegal drugs, we lost our understanding of this healing process and the healing potential of these compounds. When I was literally in the depths of despair, sure that I would never get better, I heard about other people whose lives had been changed by psychedelics. These stories were like a tiny flame of hope at the end of a very long tunnel. The faintest glimmer of hope, but hope nonetheless. So I started researching. And that's when I discovered the work of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, an organization known for doing research into the potential health benefits of drugs like MDMA, known by most of you as ecstasy. MAPS was doing these crazy trials using these substances and having the most incredible results. Mind you, the studies were small, but not for lack of evidence that they were working, but simply because of lack of funding. And quite frankly, because the drugs were illegal and still are in many places. Over 30 years ago, the US government made MDMA a Schedule I substance. That means that the US Drug Enforcement Agency decided it had a high potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical use. It also criminalized MDMA. In some states, even now, you can go to prison for MDMA possession, putting it in the same category as heroin. Excuse me. The difference, though, is that heroin, we all know, is extremely deadly. Last year, there were more than 33,000 fatal heroin overdoses in the United States alone. MDMA is a very different story. Used appropriately and in its pure form, MDMA is extremely safe. In fact, some underground psychologists in Europe and the US have been using MDMA in their practices for over 50 years with no clinical adverse reactions to date. Ironically, because the US government was so intent on proving the danger posed by this drug, they conducted extensive studies on it. More than 5,000 studies, to be specific. And all have failed to show that MDMA is a neurotoxin. Embarrassingly, the most famous study on MDMA had to be retracted after the most ridiculous mistake was discovered. Instead of doing the study with MDMA, the researchers had actually done the study with methamphetamine, or speed, and in massive doses at that, which is a completely different substance. But sadly, it was a while before the study was retracted, and it had already shaped both the minds and public policy regarding the supposed danger of MDMA. I was blown away by the results of MAPS trials on people with PTSD, so severe that they had been suffering the condition for more than 17 years on average. Can you imagine? 17 years. The studies showed that when MDMA was used as part of a psychotherapy treatment, the effect was game-changing. 1 year after treatment, 7 out of 10 of the people no longer suffered from the condition. These are people that had been suffering for 17 years on average. By comparison, only 2 out of 10 people with PTSD find relief, not healing, but relief, from traditional psychotherapy and/or psychiatric medications. Moreover, the studies have shown that prescription antidepressants like Zoloft and Prozac can actually make PTSD worse over the long term. But MDMA-assisted psychotherapy appears not only to provide short-term relief, but appears to promote such long-lasting changes in the brain that some patients are actually cured. And MDMA is not the only psychedelic that holds this incredible brain healing promise. Small-scale studies have shown that ayahuasca, a psychedelic brew made by Amazonian tribes and used for millennia, is a powerful tool in addiction rehabilitation treatments. The same goes for ibogaine, a potent psychedelic derived from an African shrub, which is being used in heroin and other opiate rehab programs. It has been shown to help even extreme addictions in over 7 out of 10 study participants. Still, it's not a panacea. Ibogaine has very serious downside. It can cause fatal heart arrhythmias in about 1 out of 300 people. But by administering ibogaine in a fully medicalized clinic with trained medical professionals, those risks can be almost completely avoided. For example, of the thousands of people treated at the Crossroads Clinic in Mexico, only a handful had serious complications. And the fact is that most addicts are risking their lives every single time that they use. Isn't it our responsibility to allow them to take a calculated risk if it could save their life? Other psychedelics, like psilocybin, better known as magic mushrooms, and LSD, are known to have promising clinical applications, especially in treating depression, anxiety, and brain injuries. The truth is that psychedelics probably can heal the mind. I therefore believe that psychedelics are medtech. That was funny. My point is, we need to change the way we regulate these drugs in order to open the door for further research. And we need to change the way we think about these compounds so we can get these healing drugs to market and to the legions of people in need as soon as possible. I believe mental health is a human right. Denying people access to tools that could save their life is inhuman and unconscionable. While it is true that these compounds appear to work, the lack of research means we don't fully understand how they work, only that the research overwhelmingly suggests that they do. But just because something is not understood does not mean it should be ignored. Arthur C. Clarke once said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." Right now, psychedelics are that magic technology. Psychedelics are that medtech. It's like someone dropping a fully functioning car in the middle of a civilization that was still developing the wheel. We will get there one day if the Elon Musks and the Tej Chanis and the Brian Johnsons keep pushing. But it could be a pretty long time coming. And in the interim, some of us have places that we need to be. A hitchhiker is someone without a vehicle who gets a ride with someone who has one to go somewhere they need to go. Someone once said, "Fear is a reaction, but courage is a decision." People are wary of psychedelics because they don't totally understand how it works, and in fact, we're just starting to. It is, in a sense, magic, the highest form of technology and the highest form of medtech. So you decide, shall we walk? Or do you have the courage to jump on board and hitchhike with me so we can all get further, faster, and for some of us, escape a level of suffering we don't deserve to have to live with? The choice is yours, but whatever you do, just keep going. And as the famous line from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy urges, don't panic. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Khaliya, for the session. And now Khaliya will take some questions. So don't leave yet, just a few more minutes. So I hand over to Jenny.
Anyone have a question? I see the woman in black down there. One moment.
Sorry, I have a cold. I keep sniffling. I apologize.
Yes, research on the subject, but neuroimaging, right? They have data, neuroimaging data.
Khaliya, Joanna here was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the research, specifically if there's any neuroimaging going on in this research.
Absolutely. So the Imperial College of London has done a significant amount of fMRI studies, and what it shows is that when you give compounds such as LSD, you have the two parts of the brain, each hemisphere, integrated in a way that we've never seen before. It literally lights up in a way that we didn't actually know we could do, which does induce, in a lot of ways, neuroplasticity, which is why it has this potential to be such a groundbreaking drug. In contrast, something like magic mushrooms also lights out different parts of the brain, but importantly, it tampers down on the part of your brain that is responsible for your sort of ego, the default mode network. And so it makes it so that the ways in which you're getting in your own way go away. So for people with depression, people with anxiety, people who are stuck, it really helps them. And they've done amazing tests with people that have end-of-life anxiety, that are literally crippled, even though they're living, by this fear of death. And these people have said that this was one of that taking a full dose of psilocybin for them was on par with the birth of a child, getting married, the birth of a loved one. This was one of the most important experiences of their entire life and changed their worldview permanently and made it so that from there on they did not have the same distress, the same fear of death that they had before. And this is in one session with psychotherapy before, psychotherapy after, but literally one day.
Khaliya, we have another question here from Carolina. Carolina's wondering if you can talk a little bit about research into ketamine.
So ketamine is doing, they're doing a lot of research into ketamine now, and it's very promising for depression. I'm not a massive fan in the sense that I think that it helps, but I don't think that it's the same cure that you can find with something like LSD, psilocybin, which actually helps to reroute the neural networks of your brain. It helps you to think differently, to not have these constant patterns of going into fearful thinking, of going into anxiety thinking. For example, with me, with PTSD, what they find with people with PTSD is that you are actually so traumatized at what happened that instead of being able to think about it, you don't go into the prefrontal cortex, you go straight from the amygdala to action. And the amygdala is the part of your brain that is in charge of fight or flight. So this is layman's terms, this is not scientific, but to make it understood by you all, it's almost like you are cutting your brain out of the equation and you have no choice in the matter. Because your body is like, I need to live, I need to survive. You can't think about this, you just need to run. And what these drugs can do is train your brain to find new patterns, to reroute around this sort of highway that you've created between fear and action. I always think of it as like cockroaches. I don't know if you've ever seen cockroaches. You turn on the lights, they move so quickly that it disturbs you. Cockroaches do that because their brain is actually located in a different part of their body. They have a part of their body that has an automatic reaction. And in some ways, obviously not the same, but when you have an overactive amygdala, when you have a panic reaction, you are like that cockroach. The light goes on, a sound goes on, and you just run, you just panic. You can't think anymore. Your action goes before your cognitive thinking about it. And what this does is disable that. Because neurons that fire together wire together. And when you've been wired for fear, you create this massive highway, and your brain automatically always wants to take that route. But with things like psilocybin, LSD, that actually increase the neuroplasticity and increase the amount of connections between different parts of your brain, it's like Google Maps just said, you know what, this highway's closed, let's take another one. And once you start using that other road, you develop the neural connections that make it a road that your brain knows to take the next time. So you actually neural reroute, you change the way that your brain can respond, can behave. You change yourself, and in a positive way.
Khaliya, Winfred here has a question about your biography, your background. He's wondering how the fact that your dad worked in computer science affected your own personal trajectory.
Well, this is kind of a personal question, but it affected me in this way, which is that my mom was a psychologist, my dad was a computer scientist, and sometimes you're talking to your mom, she's asking you deep questions about how you feel and your psychological state, and you're like, you know what, I just want to go build something. So I had this kind of very nuanced perspective where I love to talk about things, I love to dive into emotion, but I also love to just make things, to just solve things. And so I love to escape to this world where you just can code, where you can create something out of nothing, where you can find solutions. When I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Bulgaria for 2 years, and I was put in a town where you have one other English-speaking person, and it just so happened that the English-speaking person that was with me had Asperger's. And luckily, I studied computer science in college. I was one of 3 women in my program back then, because it was not really a thing that women did. And so I had done a lot of programming. And he would say, I just don't know what to do. I sit down next to somebody, and they're trying to be friendly, and I just don't know what to say. But meanwhile, he was one of the smartest people I've ever met. He spoke 7 languages fluently. He had a memory like AI. I mean, it was insane. And so I just said, listen, why don't we program you? If she says this, then you have 4 options in terms of responses, and go all the way down the line so he could have a whole conversation. And he slowly was like, I get this. I can do this. Now I know. I just memorize it, and actually, once I started doing it, it starts these neural connections happening where I can socialize again. He is now married with 3 kids. He almost got kicked out of the Peace Corps because somebody told him to do something that was completely inappropriate, and he didn't understand that he shouldn't do it because he didn't have those social skills. So I think that there is this beautiful marriage between the brain and actually sort of coding, technology, this idea of rewiring, this idea of recoding people is huge.
Inez had a question about side effects. What do we know about the different side effects of these different psychedelics? And also that piggybacks on a question that Jay here had. He has an organization that works with people who are dealing with problems that have arisen from the actual use of psychedelics. So they're both wondering if you can speak to the dangers that may be lurking. Perhaps we don't know enough about them because not enough research has been done.
I think that, psychedelics can be very dangerous. It is definitely something that you want to do in the right context. Context, environment, these things are all critical. Setting an intention in the beginning. That's why, this promotion of psychedelics is not, let's make this a prescription drug. It's, let's make this something that's available under clinical supervision for people. Because I have also seen people that went on an ayahuasca ceremony and they're just not the same anymore. They never really came back. These are powerful compounds. It's like putting nuclear code in people's hands. But used correctly, they can do incredible magical things. Used incorrectly, they can break someone. So I would caution, the use of psychedelics without knowing what you're doing, without having a sitter, without being careful, and doing it in a setting that you'll be safe.
We have 2 last questions here. One from Marisa, who is a psychologist, who is wondering about whether there are other medtech approaches that can also help change the stigma that people with mental health issues face. And also we had another question from a woman who's wondering about whether or not hypnosis can affect the same sort of changes that psychedelics bring about?
Well, certainly there are things that can help that are not psychedelic. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of exercise, and not just, your 1 hour a day, but really, really intense exercise until you sort of break down your patterns, get out of your environment. This can make changes, but it's harder. It's not as easy when you don't have this induced neuroplasticity that you have through psychedelics. So yes, there are things. Hypnosis helps. I don't think that it can change enough. Personally, I think it can help, but I don't think that it can make the kind of embedded neural changes that you need to really change your behavior and to change who you are as a person. Was there another part of the question that I forgot?
That was it.
Okay. I think there's a question there.
They wanted to end with that, but we can do one more,
Okay.
I suppose.
And thank you all for staying and for being so curious. I really appreciate it.
She's just wondering if you can explain a little more the mechanisms that allow psychedelics to help patients within the realm of talk therapy. Like, how does it get them to be able to access topics that they perhaps weren't able to talk about before? What are the mechanisms there?
So essentially, my mom's a psychologist, so obviously I grew up with psychoanalytic theory. I grew up going to a shrink myself, not even because I had problems, but just because that in my family was a normal thing to do. And there's a lot that you can accomplish with psychotherapy. I'm not knocking psychotherapy, but the thing is that your brain is trying to protect you all the time from things that will cause you pain. And there are some memories, there are some things that you just don't want to go into. You don't want to go there. In my case, I couldn't even talk about what happened to me for years. It was 3.5 years before I even said to anyone that anything had happened. And then it was 6 months until I said, you know what, I should do something about this. I know that this is what's crippling me. Our brain is wanting to help us. It literally creates a cocoon around the things that it thinks will hurt us to protect us. But if you can break down that cocoon, I always think of it as people that have been through something horrible or violent. It's like they have a capsule of poison inside their bodies. And they know if it breaks open, it will kill them. It's more than they can handle. But if you could take it piece by piece, if you could sort of have just a drop a day, at the end of it, you would be immunized. And on top of that, you would know the poison and you might even be able to help vaccinate others. So I consider myself somebody that figured out over time how to swallow that poison, how to turn it into a strength that I could give to other people. And I think that that's what psychedelics can do. So for example, with PTSD, because of the fact that MDMA increases the amount of serotonin and oxytocin, the sort of feel-good feelings, even if you're looking at the most horrible memory in your entire life, you can't physiologically feel the fear. You can't have a fear reaction. And so suddenly it's like you're in a house and there's always this scary dark room and you never wanted to open the door. You were so frightened of what was in that room. But with that running through your system, the oxytocin, the serotonin, you're like, you know what? I wonder what is in that room. I don't know. Can't hurt me, not right now. And you open up the door and you realize the thing you were so scared of is actually not scary at all. It's just a part of you. So the mechanism of action is actually enabling your brain to look at things that it doesn't want to look at by increasing these connections or by increasing the kinds of neurotransmitters that make it so you don't have the response that tells your brain not to go there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.